One day, 6 months later, when I'd done a really hard day's work, I went out to take my dogs for a walk on the cliff. And I was feeling tired. I was really feeling that I'd exhausted myself. Now, when I do this, I've got used to this fact: do not accept your own exhaustion. That if any crisis came along, like losing Sally in Cheltenham, I would instantly pull myself out of it. So I have huge reserves of energy. That exhaustion is merely superficial. All I have to do is to reach down and grab the energy. Now, what I usually do is a form of concentration exercise which is based upon that peculiar experience described by Graham Greene. He described how, as a teenager, he got into states of total miserable boredom as a result of being successfully psychoanalyzed, and that, as a consequence, he had ceased to see any visual beauty. He said people could point out a beautiful scene to him, and he would see visually that it was beauty, but he'd feel nothing whatever. And he said in this state he discovered in a corner cupboard a revolver belonging to his elder brother, and he took it out onto Berkhamsted Common and played Russian roulette. That is, he inserted one bullet in the chambers, spun the chambers, pointed it at his head and pulled the trigger. And he said when there was just a click, he looked down the barrel and saw that the bullet had now come into position. And he said he felt a terrific, overwhelming sense of sheer happiness. He said he suddenly saw that life is infinitely interesting and fascinating. Now, so what I tend to do when I go onto the cliffs, if I get myself into this state of exhaustion, I really try to concentrate as if I put a gun to my forehead and pulled the trigger. And if I can do it seriously enough, and it sometimes takes 2 or 3 efforts, I can actually pull myself into a state of concentration in which quite suddenly everything is self-evidently interesting. I'm getting a feedback from my surroundings. And I did this on this particular day. I made a terrific mental effort. I got myself back into a state of feedback. And then I thought, what inside me did that? I thought, well, I suppose it was my, my solar plexus, my deep intuitions. Then I thought, nope, wasn't. I thought about it more, and then suddenly I saw. It was just the ordinary Colin Wilson, the ordinary, everyday me. And I thought, oh no, you're making a mistake. No, we all know that the ordinary, everyday you is either a weakling or a villain, and that you should never trust reason and this kind of thing. And I thought, no, it's true, it's the ordinary, everyday me. And then suddenly it hit me. I thought, my God, Howard Miller is right. I rushed home and I wrote him a letter saying, do you realize you are the greatest psychologist of the 20th century? And I still firmly believe this, incidentally. He's your greatest unknown psychologist. And he still lives in New Jersey in his mid-70s, totally unknown. Miller had suddenly hit upon it. You see, think of Hemingway saying, all those times during the war, when under crisis you did the one thing, the only thing, and it always came out right. When the real you suddenly takes over. You realize that half the time the real you is sitting in a corner of the room, sort of smoking with his legs crossed, bored stiff. A crisis comes along and he suddenly hurtles into action, and suddenly everything changes. The real you is suddenly, as it were, behind the steering wheel. It's as if you tried to drive your car from the passenger seat. And as if when a crisis comes, you suddenly move across into the driver's seat. And as soon as you do that, everything's much easier. Those moments when you do the one thing, the only thing, and it always comes out right. This is what Miller meant. It is the freedom experience. The German philosopher Fichte said, to be free is nothing. To become free is heavenly. And everybody knows this is true. I remember a friend of ours telling us how she got absolutely sick of the fact that her husband was being unfaithful to her, and she decided to leave him, and her brother said, well, I've got a job in Ohio, come along and act as my housekeeper. And her husband at the same time said, oh, for God's sake, don't do that, I'm going to Oregon, come with me. And she said she spent nights lying in torment should she stick with her husband and children or go off with her brother and take the children. And she said suddenly one night in the middle of the night when she was agonizing, it suddenly hit her. she did not have to go to either place. She was free. And she said it was a revelation of absolute sheer happiness. And she said that she was so happy that even her tennis improved. She said, for days she just walked around in this feeling, I'm free, I'm free, I'm free. Now, this is the basic experience. When the real you gets behind the steering wheel, quite suddenly you are free and everything changes. Now, this was what I discovered. That in fact, the real you is the you that takes over when Graham Greene pointed the gun at his head and pulled the trigger. That normally the real you is being strangled, so to speak, by a feeling of passivity and what you might call the false you, which is sitting on your shoulders like that old man of the sea in the Sinbad the Sailor story, with its legs wrapped around his neck, squeezing the breath out of him. And do you remember what happens? Sinbad brews wine and gets the old man of the sea drunk, and finally manages to throw him off his shoulders and smash his brains out. Well, this is what happens in all these moments when you do the one thing, the only thing. You suddenly throw the old man of the sea off your shoulders, the real you takes charge, the false you is left lying on the ground, and suddenly that peculiar feeling of certainty and triumph. What I had discovered is that I could do this by a certain act of concentration. And I discovered it partly through that experience of panic attacks when I was being dragged so deeply into total misery that I was tempted to give up and to believe that the real me had no strength at all. As soon as I was forced to cling, just to cling on, to refuse to let go, I began to see that the real me has far more strength than I normally recognized. And that morning, when, as I say, I bent down to pick up something off the ground and it suddenly went like that, and a feeling of total freedom, I suddenly realized that it is that ordinary you in the left cerebral hemisphere that has the real power. We need nothing else whatsoever. I could see that the Graham Greene experience is in a way the answer. That contains the germ of the solution. Concentrate on that and you've begun to get it. Then I saw that there's a fairly simple way of doing this. It's what I began to call the pen trick. All you do is take an ordinary pen or any other sort of object and hold it in your hand like that against a blank wall. Now, concentrate upon it as if your life depended on it. Really concentrate as if, you know, you're about to slam the car door and you realize you've almost caught your child's fingers in it and you think, oh my God, and really put some effort into it. Concentrate. Then let go and see the wall against the background of the pen. Then concentrate again. Then let go again. Now you'll find that when you've done this about half a dozen times, if you were doing it properly, it actually begins to hurt you behind the eyes. And when that begins to happen, keep going. Don't let go. You'll find that if you can keep on doing it, say a dozen times, when it really begins to hurt, you go into the peak experience. It's the Graham Greene trick, but you're doing it slowly, step by step, instead of in one go, by pointing a gun at your head, which is more dangerous. Now, the main problem of doing that is, as I say, it's incredibly difficult for us human beings to remember to do it. We forget so easily, and that is the real problem. It's just ordinary forgetfulness. So part of your problem is to try to do it with enough regularity not to forget in between. That's of tremendous importance. Do you remember the story which I tell at the beginning of Mysteries of how Fritz Peters, who was one of Gurdjieff's young pupils, during the war, he had an almost total breakdown as an American soldier and went to see Gurdjieff in Paris just after the war in a state of total misery. And he said Gurdjieff looked absolutely horrible himself. He was obviously worn out and exhausted. And Peter said that Gurdjieff said to him, "Come and sit in the kitchen and drink some hot coffee." And then he went out of the room, and Peters was so upset and nervous he couldn't stay there and left the room. And when Gurdjieff saw how miserable he was, he said, "Look, just sit there, drink the coffee as hot as you can." And as Peters began to drink the hot coffee, he said, quite suddenly, he began to feel absolutely superb. Energy began to flow into him. He said he looked at Gurdjieff, and Gurdjieff appeared to have a kind of blue glow around his head. He said, and then just as he was feeling absolutely marvellous, Gurdjieff relaxed, the blue glow went away, and Gurdjieff himself looked absolutely awful once again, drained. Now, I said, at that moment, the doorbell rang, and a group of people turned up. Gurdjieff dragged himself to the door and let them in, and came back about a quarter of an hour later, and, to Peter's surprise, he looked absolutely marvellous once again. He said he was glowing with health as if he'd just come back from a long Mediterranean holiday. And Gurdjieff said to Peters, "You have made me make a tremendous effort, but it has been very good for both of us. Thank you for reminding me." You can see what happened. Gurdjieff let himself put all this energy into Peters, let himself be totally drained. Then as he was going to the door, suddenly thought, "Gurdjieff, you fool! You're exhausted and yet you've just given him all that energy. There's plenty more to be had where that came from." And made this peculiar effort that immediately revitalized him. And yet he, even Gurdjieff, had forgotten that he could do it. Otherwise, why was he so exhausted when Peters arrived in the first place? It's this interesting recognition that we have almost infinite energy inside us which we can call upon. Now, when I went to Finland in 1980, I met a rather interesting character called Brad Absets, who was an American from Oberlin, who was teaching at this place Vitakivi, which was a kind of commune in the middle of Finland supported by the government. And he met us off the train, and on the way out to Vitakivi, Brad began telling me that he'd been writing poetry, and my heart sank. I thought, oh Christ, you know, because they always want you to read it. And, but he suddenly made this interesting comment. He said, "You know, I didn't write it." And oddly enough, I instantly knew what he meant. And a couple of days later, he came along to our chalet and brought some of his poems, and they were very, very good. They had a kind of tight clarity and precision of language, which I loved. None of the usual sort of, you know, subjective vomit. And I said, "How did you come to write them?" And he then told me this extraordinary story. He said that a few years before, he and his wife had adopted a young baby, which had been sick and totally neglected in its earlier days. And he said, unfortunately, the baby screamed the whole time. So, you know, it wasn't a very lovable sort of child. And although they did their best, if a baby screams all the time, obviously you don't really feel capable of giving much affection. And after 2 years, the baby developed cancer and then took another year to die. And he said by this time they were utterly miserable. And his wife immediately went into nervous breakdown after the death of the baby. Well, he said she would lie on the bed and go into these total states of depression in which she became unaware of the external world. And he said he would lie on the bed at the side of her, waiting for her to recover from these states, so that he was there to help her and support her. Well, this went on for days. He said, and if you're lying on a bed at the side of someone, you relax, you know, if it goes on for hour after hour after hour. At the same time, he was wide awake, waiting for the slightest sign of movement on her part. And so he was fully alert and yet totally relaxed. And he said one day, as he was doing this, suddenly he had a peculiar feeling as if he was rising up off the bed. And he said, after this, odd things began to happen. He said he came back one day from skiing, the first time of the year, and he said, your legs hurt like mad. He said, as he lay on the bed starting to massage his legs, to his amazement, one of his legs went up into the air and proceeded to do a series of kind of circular movements. Then the other leg went up into the air while he lay watching them with astonishment. He said, and after 5 minutes, his legs were absolutely fine, no pain whatever. He said, 24 hours later, he went into the big dining hall at Vitakivi, where there's a table with macrobiotic food which you help yourself to. He said, and as he was going in there, suddenly his hand began to do this, and he thought, here we go again. And he said he let his hand do what it wanted to, and it reached out and took food that he would not normally have taken. And he said, after a while, a couple of days, he said sometimes his hand would not take any food at all. And he was so curious as to what it was up to, he made no attempt to force it. And he said he would sit there ravenously hungry, and his friends would say, aren't you hungry today? So, no, I don't feel like food. But he said that after something like 2 weeks, he'd lost 10 pounds in weight and felt better than he'd ever felt in his life before. And he continued to do this. He said, for example, his little daughter brought him some crayons and said, do me a drawing, Daddy. And his hand began to do this. Here we go again. And it started to do these incredible drawings. I've seen them. They're kind of psychedelic pictures. They look like patterns. He did 80 of these, and every one is totally different from every other, and every one is incredibly beautiful and precise. And it wasn't he who did it. By now, both his hands were doing it. So that, for example, one day he got a lot of old metal left over from holes being stamped in a big sheet of metal, and his hand began to do this again, and he left it to do what it wanted to. He began to slice up the metal and then turn it into the most incredible metal sculptures. I've seen these, and they really are very, very remarkable. And he said that sometimes it would start to do something with the metal and a pair of pliers, and he would think, no, that won't work at all. But it always did. It always came out perfect. Now, what had happened, obviously, was that in these states of total relaxation, that other person in the right brain, which is normally like a very scared little housewife who never dares to say a word to a highly dominant husband, had suddenly started expressing herself, and suddenly began to express herself as fully as his left brain. And suddenly he got the two halves in perfect cooperation. He said, for example, he used to keep bees. And once he did this with the two halves in cooperation, he never again got stung, and the quality of his honey improved enormously. In some strange way, something inside him took over. Now, I was fascinated by this. I said, you've got to write this down. And he said, no, I can't write. So I said, okay, I will write it for you. And I wrote a short book called Access to Inner Worlds, in which I described how this is possible. Now, this is obviously one immensely important half of it. But when I thought about it, I saw that in a sense I'd already got it. Because think what happens when Graham Greene puts the gun to his head and pulls the trigger. He's done much quicker what Brad did over a long period lying there on the bed. He simply brought those two halves together like that. Instant result, total cooperation between the you and the non-you inside you. And this wonderful feeling of ecstasy. Now, you can see what I'm getting at. You can see my central point. If you are unaware of that other self, then you're not going to make any attempt to get into contact with it and make it cooperate. Once you become aware that it is there, once the ordinary logical you becomes convinced that it is there, then you will never again fall into this error of assuming that you are on your own, which is the basis of all misery and depression and so on. And this appears to be the central recognition here. Incidentally, when I was at Vitakivi, I did an interesting experiment which struck me as very significant. I was in a class with my students, and I was trying to teach them how much control they had over their own minds. And I said, listen, depress yourselves. Think of the most miserable things you can think of, the worst experiences you've ever had. Get yourself into a state of total depression. Then, when they were depressed, I said, okay, now undepress yourselves. And they all looked sort of rather surprised, and I said, listen, you've just depressed yourself, now undepress yourselves. If you can depress yourself, you can undepress yourselves. And as soon as I began to show them that you could do this kind of thing with the mind, I began to get some very interesting results. For example, one day, I got them all lying on their backs on the floor, doing the pen trick, holding the pen up against the ceiling, and I would say, okay, concentrate. Now, let go. Now, concentrate. Now, let go. Now, at the same time, I'd been teaching them Reichian breathing. Wilhelm Reich used to say to his patients, you lie on the floor, breathe in very deeply into your lungs, and then breathe out from your lungs, down through your solar plexus, and through your genitals, as it were, pushing the energy downwards. Out, down, through. And I tried this. I said, listen, as well as doing the pen trick, which should concentrate you, let's try doing Reichian breathing, which should have the opposite effect. It suddenly struck me that since we were concentrating and relaxing, we should be able to do this, reinforce the effect. So I said, okay, as you take in your deep breath, concentrate. Now, as you let it out, out, down, through. And I suddenly discovered that as we were lying there, we all went into a state of most peculiar ecstasy. I myself was totally relaxed, and everybody else in the room had obviously gone into a deeply relaxed and totally happy state. But we didn't get below that threshold into any kind of sleepiness because concentrate. And every time you concentrated, it started all over again. And after half an hour, I looked at my watch and said, hey, lunch started 40 minutes ago. And we all leapt to our feet and went out. We'd gone into such a state of total relaxation that time ceased to matter. Now, oh dear, it's 9:30. Let me finish by trying to get back to what we were saying at the beginning. Remember, I was talking about Ouspensky and these curious mystical states in which almost immediately language ceases to be able to handle what we are doing. Ideas and insights fly with such tremendous speed that language can no longer keep up with them. Ouspensky said that when he walked around the streets of St. Petersburg, inducing these states of intensity, he felt as if the houses were communicating with him, were actually talking to him. He could suddenly tell the history of every house that he looked at. And incidentally, you know that we know how he did that, because in his book on Gurdjieff, In Search of the Miraculous, he describes how he did this using Gurdjieff's technique of ordinary self-remembering. That is to say, you simply look at your watch, so your attention becomes an arrow pointing outwards. Then you close your eyes and you forget your watch as if your arrow is now pointing inwards. Now, look at your watch and become aware of yourself looking at it as if you have a double-headed arrow pointing simultaneously outwards and inwards. Now, you'll find that you cannot do that for more than a few seconds together. Suddenly, you're either just seeing your watch and you've forgotten you, or you're remembering you and you've forgotten your watch. It's incredibly difficult to maintain that concentration. But you will find that if you can actually push yourself up to that level of intensity, you will stay there. You've got the billiard balls up on 2 rows, and you won't collapse back into the old state. Now, it was in this state that Ouspensky, as he describes in Search of the Miraculous, began to feel as if the houses were actually communicating and talking to him. Now, ask the question, were they really communicating, or was it just his imagination? It doesn't matter. In fact, in many cases, we know that such communications do really come straight through. We call it psychometry, and there are people who can just pick up any object and tell you its history by some kind of feeling from the object itself. I've no doubt whatever that to some extent Ouspensky was exercising psychometry in looking at the houses, but that is not the point. What is really the point is that as soon as he got into that state of intense concentration, he cleared away the subjective mess that prevents us from seeing things clearly, and suddenly he was seeing with a kind of total reality as if looking through a magnifying glass. Look, think. Why, when you were in bed on a freezing winter morning and you've got to get up in 5 minutes, does the bed seem so deliciously warm? And why is it that on a Sunday, when you can stay in bed all morning, you cannot recreate that intensity of involvement? Why was it that when Dostoevsky was put in front of a firing squad and knew that he only had 3 minutes to live, he suddenly lived with such total intensity that he divided the 3 minutes up? 1 minute to think about his past, 1 minute about the present, 1 minute about the future, and lived with such terrific intensity in those moments that he felt, that he could stay wide awake forever. He put that into Crime and Punishment later, when Raskolnikov, the murderer, thinking that he may be arrested and executed, suddenly thinks, if I had to stand on a narrow ledge for ever and ever in eternal darkness and eternal tempest, I would still rather do that than die at once. Now think, what would you do on a narrow ledge forever and ever? Yet you know perfectly well that if somebody now put a gun to your forehead and offered you the choice, you would instantly say, as Raskolnikov did, that you prefer the narrow ledge. You know the answer. And the answer is that in that peculiar state of intensity, which we even get in bed on a winter morning, it's almost as if your face is reflected in a mirror. You are in a state of self-reflection. Whatever is happening to you is happening to you with such intensity that the automatic part of you has no time to take over. And we suddenly know that this is an ordinary possibility of the human mind. That is the fundamental answer. Now, Ouspensky said that as soon as he got into his intense mystical state, he suddenly realized that all is well. Everything is good. We have nothing fundamentally to worry about whatsoever. All of our worries and anxieties are stupid. He said, what is more, when he asked himself, aren't I just exaggerating in some way? He felt, no, this is real. It is the ordinary world to which I shall return after this experience, which is unreal. All mystics have said the same. The mystical experience is realer than our ordinary reality. Every single one of them. And he then said that as you came down out of these experiences, you came down into the ordinary realm in which language once again begins to apply, and then you are back on earth in this wooden realm where everything moves with tremendous difficulty. And so what are we going to do once we're back in the wooden realm? What can we do? That's the great question. And you can see, if you've begun to gather what I'm talking about, that I'm beginning to tell you the answer. I'm saying, forget inspiration and mysticism and any other sort of yogic forms of discipline. Forget them. The answer lies in your ordinary left brain self. That is the thing that has to be strengthened, and that, once it begins to know its direction, in the way that Dostoevsky knew his direction as he stood in front of a firing squad and achieved that peculiar state of self-reflection in which the present moment is totally real, then, quite suddenly, you see the answer. I'm going on for just 2 more minutes. Do you see that what I'm saying in effect is this? What's wrong with human existence is that we have no real memory of what we are supposed to do. We all know fundamentally what we're supposed to do, but we've no real memory of it for most of the time. It's like going into a room to look for something and forgetting what you've gone in for. Auden says in one of his poems, the answer that I cannot find is known to my unconscious mind. I have no reason to despair because I am already there. We've all had that experience again and again. And yet, it continues to elude us in ordinary consciousness. We look for the answer, so to speak, in extraordinary consciousness, and there we are wrong. The answer lies in perfectly ordinary consciousness. And
Okay, I'm gone.
okay, do you like me to get started? Stand up here. Hello. Reminds me of my days on Hyde Park. I thought I'd just say a few words before I begin the signing, because quite a few people the other evening asked me various questions, and I said I'd try to answer them at the book signing. One of the basic things that I missed out when I was speaking the other evening here, and that I really want to elaborate on, is an idea called Faculty X, which I brought into various books, and which I first wrote about in The Occult. Faculty X is basically that sudden feeling that you get at certain times of the intense reality of another time and another place. The most typical example, of course, is the famous one I'm always quoting of Proust tasting the Madeleine dipped in tea and suddenly having this extremely clear feeling of his childhood in Combray. But the interesting thing being that Proust says that as he tasted the Madeleine dipped in tea, he said, "A peculiar pleasure passed through my senses. I had ceased to feel mediocre, accidental, mortal." Why should he cease to feel mediocre, accidental, mortal? Merely because he remembers that he was a child in Combray, something he must have known anyway. Now, this was the fascinating problem. G.K. Chesterton says somewhere, we say thank you when someone passes the salt, but we don't mean it. We say the earth is round, but we don't mean it, even though it's true. On the other hand, an astronaut in space could say the earth is round and mean it. And that's obviously the difference for Proust. He could have said, I was a child in Combray, but in a funny sense he would not have meant it. Then he tastes the biscuit dipped in tea, it suddenly brings back his past with tremendous immediate intensity, and he could say, I was a child in Combray, and mean it. Do you remember, I was quoting the other night that story by Ernest Hemingway called Soldier's Home, which describes the soldier coming back from the First World War, and how in his small town in the Midwest he's completely and totally bored. And Hemingway says something like, he talked to other people about his experiences during the war, those times when under crisis you did the one thing, the only thing, and it always came out right. And then he says, but talking about them, he somehow ceased to believe them himself. Again, you see, this business of saying something and not meaning it. This is the odd thing, that in a strange sort of way, our minds tend to wipe out our experience like the sea washing the sand on the beach until it's flattened it completely. But Proust's experience with a Madeleine dipped in tea seems to prove that this is not a necessity. I was fascinated always by those experiences described by Arnold Toynbee in the last volume of his Study of History. He says that he began to write this enormous 10-volume work because of a number of experiences he had in which history became totally real to him. What happened was that he went to Greece for the first time when he was about 20 years old in 1912, and as a young student of history was all excited about ancient Greece, and that on a number of occasions at certain spots he suddenly had with extraordinary reality a vision of the past. The most famous one was when he was sitting on the summit of the citadel of Mystra, which had been deserted for over 100 years since the Greek war that Byron took part in, and that sitting there on the summit, he looked down at a particular place in the wall, and it suddenly struck him that there, a century ago, barbarians had poured into the city, murdered half the inhabitants, and that ever since then, the city had been this ruin that was now around him. It's still more or less deserted. And Toynbee said at that moment, he could almost see the barbarians coming over the wall. It was totally real, as if he was there a century earlier. Now, this sounds like ordinary imagination. But in fact, on other occasions, it's quite clear that this is not so. For example, he was sitting on the summit of Pharsalus, where there'd been a battle about 193 BC between the Greeks and the Romans. He says that as he was sitting on this very misty landscape, the clouds suddenly seemed to roll aside, and he actually saw the battle taking place. But he also says that one thing puzzled him. He saw 3 horsemen galloping away across the side of the hill, and he couldn't quite make out who they were or what they were doing. Again, he was in the old theatre in Ephesus, the Greek theatre, where in the Acts of the Apostles, St. Paul has described the way that the citizens of Ephesus strongly objected to Christianity, and a meeting had taken place there that lasted most of an afternoon. And again, he said, in the theatre in Ephesus, he had this extremely clear vision of the commotion taking place, could recognize St. Paul and somebody else, was extremely puzzled by another man whom he could not recognize. And later, looking it up in the Acts of the Apostles, came to the conclusion, that he was somebody or other, one of the Ephesians mentioned there. Now, it's quite clear that these visions were extremely precise, exactly like hallucinations, detailed. Now, we know that this kind of thing can happen. There's a famous case of a Scottish mountain climber called Smythe, Sir Frank Smythe, who, making his way over the Scottish hills one afternoon, sat down to eat his lunch and suddenly had an overpowering feeling of evil in this glen where he'd stopped. And then said he suddenly saw a group of people coming over the hill into the glen, looking like Stone Age people, sort of dressed very roughly. And then when they were halfway across, quite suddenly, troops in ambush leapt out on them, again dressed in old-fashioned clothes, and massacred all of them. And he said he was so sickened by the sight of the massacre and the screams of these women and children that he got up and hurried away as fast as he could. Now, when he checked later, there had in fact been a massacre in the glen in Roman times. And in some strange way, this had been reenacted. T.C. Lethbridge, the dowser who died 10 years ago or so, was convinced that damp places actually tape record strong emotional forces, events that have taken place there, and that people who, like himself, happen to be good dowsers, can actually pick up this vision when they walk into the place. In fact, only 2 or 3 weeks ago, my wife went along to our local ancient jail in Bodmin, which is near us in Cornwall, taking my accountant and someone else. And she took her dowsing rods along with her for fun. And she said all 3 of them got tremendously strong reactions in the execution shed and in the execution cell, the cell where they kept the people before they executed them. All 3 of them got the same very powerful reaction. Now, I've no doubt whatever that this was not imagination. I've experienced the same kind of thing myself too often to believe that. Somehow, what has happened there has left its tape recording almost on the walls of the place, and people can pick it up when they go later. So, to some extent, this is Faculty X, and yet that's by no means the whole story. Oh, thank you. I think that Toynbee, to some extent, picked up what had happened there and had been, so to speak, recorded. Thank you. But that also the fact that he knew precisely what had happened as a historian, and was therefore, in a sense, able to add a dimension of reality to it himself, somehow recreated the scene of the past. He also says that on one of these 10 occasions, he describes 10 experiences of the same sort. On one of the 10 occasions, walking past Victoria Station, again in about 1912, he said he suddenly had a vision of all history at once. This was a kind of mystical insight. He said suddenly he saw all history as a kind of enormous river, or rather he grasped that history is real. He grasped history as a reality, and suddenly saw his own life as a kind of a little wavelet on this enormous river. And then he said it lasted a few seconds and passed away. Now, this kind of thing is always happening to mystics. It happens again and again and again. And the other evening, I was describing Ouspensky's experience, which he describes in a chapter called Experimental Mysticism in A New Model of the Universe. He makes this interesting comment that almost as soon as he managed to put himself into these states of heightened consciousness, which he said, incidentally, was surprisingly easy to do, he almost immediately left behind the realm of language and found himself in a realm where impressions came so fast that it was impossible for language to keep up with them. So that between the words of a sentence, so many new ideas would dawn on him that he couldn't even finish the sentence. He was just completely overwhelmed, so to speak, by what you might call visions. But not really visions, just things connected with what he was saying. So, for example, when he used the word time, he was so overwhelmed by all the implications of the word time that he couldn't remember what the next word of the sentence was. Now, this strikes me as being a vital clue to what we are now talking about. Ouspensky said that in these moods, ordinary time continued to exist. It hadn't passed away. He said, yet he got a feeling of another kind of time, of which he also became aware at the same time. And he said later on that he became aware of yet another kind of time, running, so to speak, at right angles to those other two. So from direct experience, he became convinced that time has 3 dimensions like space. I also mentioned the other evening this curious experience he had when under these mystical impressions, he asked himself, is this real and valid, or is it just my imagination? He then asked himself a practical question, shall I go to Moscow next Easter, as he always did? And he said in this position he could see quite clearly that he would not go to Moscow because certain circumstances would arise that would make it impossible, circumstances which he could not at the moment begin to foresee. In due course, exactly these circumstances arose and prevented him from going to Moscow. Now, this seems to imply that in some strange sense, things that will take place have already taken place, which seems absurd. It seems to imply that we are tied down to some rigid destiny which is impossible to escape. And yet Ouspensky did not believe this, and neither do I. To begin with, J.B. Priestley, who set out at one point to research people's time experiences and had hundreds of letters, cited some of these experiences in his book on time, and it is quite clear that people can change the future to some extent. For example, a young mother dreamed that on a camping holiday she put down her baby by the stream when she was about to wash some clothes and went back to the tent to collect the soap, leaving the baby throwing stones into the stream. When she came back a few minutes later, the baby was lying face down dead in the stream. Now, a few months later, she recognized the scene as she was about to go back to the tent, and this was because the baby was throwing stones and it suddenly came back. So she tucked the baby under her arm and took the baby back to the tent, and obviously nothing bad took place. So it does seem that in some sense we are capable of changing the future to a very small extent. And yet I become more and more convinced that in some weird sense the future is almost rigidly predetermined. And this is simply because we exercise far less willpower than we imagine we do. We're always thinking that we are making decisions when in fact, the decisions have been dictated to us by circumstances. In other words, we possess almost no power to do something deliberately. William James once said that he finally became convinced of the existence of free will when he read a definition of free will by the French philosopher Renouvier, who said, man does possess free will because we can think one thing rather than another and then decide what we're going to think next. You can actually feel yourself choosing whether you'll think about this or that. And in that sense, there's no way, so to speak, in which we can be influenced from outside. We know what we're going to think about and we can switch it at a moment's notice. This, it seems to me, is terrifically important. We possess free will, but only inside there. Externally speaking, if Ouspensky is correct, almost everything that is now happening was predestined to happen because the universe, before life came into it, was nothing more than a giant machine. And if you'd had a big enough computer, you could have fed everything into it and prophesied exactly what would happen. Once life came into the universe, this ceased to be absolutely true, because to a very small extent we possess free will. But it appears to be to an extremely small extent. Now this is why I became so fascinated in the 1970s by the subject of the occult or paranormal. I was asked to write a book by Random House, which I did simply because I needed the money. But as soon as I began to study this subject, I became increasingly fascinated because what it seemed to indicate was that we possess curious powers which we can turn on at will. We don't know quite how to turn them on, and yet, particularly in circumstances of sudden crisis, like Hemingway's The Time When You Did the One Thing, the Only Thing, and It Always Came Out Right, under these circumstances, we appear to be able to turn on odd powers. Sometimes powers of clairvoyance, foreseeing that something in the future will not work out right if we do it in such and such a way, and so on. Sometimes powers of telepathy. When I was writing a book called The Psychic Detectives, a year or two back, and writing the chapter on telepathy, I decided to try this myself just for fun. I'd gone into hospital for a minor check, and my wife was due to come and collect me at about 2 o'clock that afternoon. In fact, I was ready to be collected round about midday, and I thought, oh God, 2 hours before she comes. And then I thought, well, I'm writing about telepathy, let's try it. So I relaxed completely, concentrated very hard to try and tell her to come to the hospital or ring. 5 minutes later, the nurse came and said, your wife is on the phone, would you like her to come to the hospital now? Now, when she did come, I said, what happened? Why did you do this? And she said, oh, I was just walking into a chemist's shop, and I suddenly saw there was a telephone, and I thought I may as well ring you, but there was someone in the telephone booth, so I went into the shop, did some shopping, and then went back and rang. That accounted for the 5 minutes in the meantime. On the other hand, she was convinced that it merely came into her head. Again, this business of we believe that things are more or less free will, when actually, in this particular case, I believe it had come from my head. In other words, where this curious realm of the paranormal is concerned, we do appear to possess all kinds of peculiar powers which we don't use. I won't say that we don't know how to use, because that's the interesting thing. Under crisis, or under the right circumstances, we proceed to use them. And quite suddenly, everything is changed. Thanks. Now, I am convinced that the basic secret lies in recognizing that we possess these powers and then quite deliberately, so to speak, use them as a part of our normal equipment. You see, for example, I'm a rather tense, obsessive, sort of person. And I get terribly dehydrated in America, I don't know why, the whole time. But I'm very much an obsessive, and I find that if I'm confronted with an enormous amount of work, I tend to sort of go into bottom gear and grind away at it in a grim sort of way, and I get it done. But just occasionally, I have to call upon something else. For example, a year or two ago, a film producer called Dino De Laurentiis locked me in a hotel room in London and told me to rewrite a really lousy film script. And I read it and said, but Dino, who is the murderer? And Dino said, ha, you tell me. And I settled down to writing this absolutely filthy film script. It was really awful stuff. And I realized when I'd been working on it for 5 days that, there was no way of finishing this on time. Now, at this point, I could have got into a kind of a panic and things would have got worse. Instead, recognizing that, that this other side of the brain, because that's what it amounts to, has peculiar powers, I said, come on, right brain, do your stuff for God's sake. And then having done this with a great intensity, address this power, this prayer to the right brain, I then relaxed completely. Anyway, the writing suddenly went beautifully. And on the last day, I started at 7 in the morning, I wrote all day long, I finished it exactly 5 minutes before his secretary came to collect the final papers. And then, I said, thank you, right brain. But it was this knowledge that I'd got something inside me that would, if I wanted, take over and do it. That was the important thing. Provided you know that it's there, you can begin to use it. Now, the same kind of thing goes for what Maslow called the peak experience. As I was saying the other day, these sudden bubbling experiences of sheer overwhelming happiness that come over us in certain moments. The example I like is the one of the young mother who was watching her husband and children eating breakfast when suddenly a beam of sunlight came in through the window and she just thought, my God, aren't I lucky? And went into the peak experience. Now, Maslow said that it is impossible to recreate peak experiences at will. And yet, this struck me as obviously untrue, because whenever I have peak experiences, I notice that in a funny sort of way, I do it myself. You can see this if you think of that question, why doesn't it tickle when you tickle yourself? You can see that in a sense, the answer is that if you're about to tickle a baby, before your hands reach the baby, it's screeching with laughter. It's tickling itself. And you're sort of merely making the gesture. And this is obviously the answer. The reason it doesn't tickle when you're tickling yourself is simply because it's you and you know it's your hands, and therefore it doesn't tickle. So, you know, when you're tickling someone else, they're tickling themselves. And when you're tickling yourself, you're not tickling yourself, which is why it doesn't tickle. If you can actually recognize that, you can also begin to see the same thing about peak experiences. If you think of your vitality as being like the mercury in a thermometer, you can actually recognize that when you feel miserable, you go, ugh, that kind of feeling, oh God, it's not worth it. And you allow the mercury to sink. In the same way, when you get interested and excited about something, you get that curious feeling of optimistic expectancy. You, in a way, do something to that thermometer that makes the mercury rise, and you're aware that you are doing it. It's exactly the same kind of thing as with these so-called paranormal powers. We know how to do it, but we don't normally do it to begin with because we don't realize that we do it ourselves. The moment you begin to recognize this, you're already halfway to learning to create the peak experience for yourself. Now, I don't know whether you know that book by Julian Jaynes called The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, but he comes up with an incredibly interesting theory about the development of the human mind. He believes that our remote ancestors did not have self-consciousness in the same sense that we do, so that if they wanted to make a choice between two things, they couldn't look inside themselves and say, do I do that or that, which would be most worthwhile from my point of view. He said they had no inside, nowhere to look inside. Their eyes pointed outwards like the headlights of a car, and they couldn't turn the headlight inside. He claims that this is why in the Bible, and for example in the Iliad and the Odyssey, people kept hearing voices, which they thought were the voices of God or of the gods, telling them what to do. He says probably ancient man actually heard voices all the time. But, he says, they were not the voices of the gods, they were really the voice of the other half of the brain, the voice of the right cerebral hemisphere. They were coming into the left, which is where you live. You know, don't you, that if you split the brain down the middle, you turn into two people. And that if you take a split brain patient and you show them an orange with the left eye and an apple with the right eye, and you say to them, what have you just seen? They say an apple. If you say, write with your left hand what you've just seen, they write orange. You say, what have you just written? They reply apple. If you show them a dirty picture with the blind side of the brain, they blush. If you say, why are you blushing? They say, I don't know. You've two people living in your head, and the one who lives on the left side is what you call you, and it applies to all human beings, not just to split brain patients. Now, Jaynes claims that what happened was that at a certain point in history, the enormous crises to which the human race was subjected, he thinks as recently as 1500 BC, the time when the volcano of Santorini destroyed half of Mediterranean civilization, and then these mysterious sea peoples suddenly swept in and began to massacre people. Jaynes believed that this crisis forced man to begin, so to speak, to learn to look inside himself. And he quotes, for example, some Assyrian inscription. There's a picture of the Assyrian king who in the past has always been sitting on the throne at the side of the god, and who round about 1150 BC for the first time is found kneeling at the foot of the throne. But it's an empty throne. The god has gone. He believes this is a sign that, you know, man had changed. He's become, in other words, the person we know now. Bicameral, that is, two rooms inside the head. Now, I think Jaynes is basically wrong in one respect. We've corresponded about this at length and don't agree, but I believe that our ancient ancestors were unicameral. In other words, if you could have talked to a man of 10,000 BC, you would have met a person who was in a way much more natural than we are, who felt that curious oneness with the universe, the kind of feeling that modern man gets when he's had, 2 or 3 glasses of whiskey. You see, Walt Whitman once said that he wished human beings were more like the cows. The cows don't moan about their lot and all the rest of it. The reason's simple. Cows are drunk. They're permanently in this state of mind. We have narrowed consciousness down so that we can deal with all kinds of precise little problems. We've placed ourselves in a state, as it were, of extreme sobriety, and it's this that keeps us low. In other words, I believe that our ancestors were unicameral, but I still believe that there's great evidence that James is correct in believing that some huge change came over the human race round about 1250 BC, as recently as that. For example, there is no evidence in history whatsoever that ancient man was cruel. The Egyptians were known to treat their prisoners very well, for example, their captives, and none of these ancient pictures that have come down to us from that time on steles and rock carvings show any sign of cruelty in the modern sense of the word. Cruelty begins after about 1150 BC, when quite suddenly man seems to have become bicameral, a left-brainer. From then on, you suddenly get these appalling steles of the Assyrians showing them impaling women and children and all this kind of thing. And it's due to sheer nervous tension. James quotes some peculiar poem of the time saying something about, as he walks down the street, he is tormented by stress and headache. Something like this, which is incredible for 1000 BC. Quite suddenly, man has become modern man. Of course, the next thing that happened was extremely interesting, because he was trapped in one half of his brain in this sober, dull world without this magnificent feeling of contact with the rest of the universe. He began to do things that no cow or no relaxed human being would do, like adding up figures, for example. He actually began counting the stars, working out ways of telling when they came up over the horizon and all this kind of thing. He built the pyramids as observatories of the stars. He did all kinds of incredibly boring things, but he created science, which of course has been the beginning of everything. I mean, this is what has created our modern civilization. We're here simply because we became unicameral at that time. In other words, we're stuck in one half of the brain. Now, this for me, you see, is the really interesting problem. Here we are, in the 20th century. We've created, in a way, a magnificent civilization. We love saying that it's pretty awful, but in fact, this is mainly just a neurotic response. I remember one of my students once saying to me, "Oh, for God's sake, how can you be optimistic about a civilization that has plastic kitchen tiles?" But it does seem to me that what we've done is incredible. We've given ourselves a tremendous amount of leisure. We can think, we can read, we can escape into a sort of world inside ourselves, and round about the middle of the 18th century, we made one of the greatest and most extraordinary inventions ever. A printer called Samuel Richardson was asked to write a kind of do-it-yourself book about how to write letters. And he did this with such enjoyment, writing letters from fathers to their daughters, from mothers to sons and all the rest of it, from business people, that he decided he would write a novel in this form. And it was the first novel in our modern sense of the word. I mean, there have been things like Don Quixote and Robinson Crusoe. They weren't really novels in our sense. What Samuel Richardson did was to write this enormous novel called Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, about a young servant girl whose mistress dies, and the young master says, "Don't worry, dear, I'll take care of you. You stay here as my personal maid," and then spends the rest of the book leaping out of cupboards and trying to rape her. Now, this thing was an immense success. It was partly a success because of this sexual element. Richardson sort of is shaking his head and tut-tutting all the way through, and then in the next scene, he tears her dress off yet again. And they preached sermons about it, in churches, and half of them thought quite correctly that it was a kind of pornography, and they didn't like it. The others thought that he was all very virtuous and was teaching you not to tear girls' dresses off. But the important thing is, in a funny sense, Richardson had created the first soap opera. He'd actually, for the first time, taken the ordinary reader inside the mind of quite ordinary people like himself, not like Don Quixote. And what's more, these people living in country districts with nothing else to do, you know, sort of parsons' wives and daughters like the Brontes, began to read these novels instead of their favourite reading up until then, which, believe it or not, had been sermons. The great bestsellers of those days were volumes of sermons. You see, you can't even begin to imagine the sheer boredom of living in the year 1700. The only thing that ever happened to you was to go to church on Sunday and, as it were, lose yourself in the sermon of the parson. The result is that you came out all happy and refreshed and bought the volume of sermons when it appeared. Now suddenly along came Samuel Richardson and produced this completely new art form in which you took off on a magic carpet into somebody else's life. You spent days being Pamela. And when he wrote a novel even twice as long called Clarissa, in which the girl does get raped in the end, you spent sort of days being the heroine and the wicked hero who sort of chases her throughout the novel and finally drugs her and has her taken to a brothel. It's interesting, by the way, to notice that these first two novels were interesting to people because he deliberately harnessed the emotion of sexuality. He used sex as his rocket fuel for producing this enormous imaginative revolution. And as soon as he'd done this, hundreds of people began to do it. You know, after Richardson, Smollett and Fielding and Goethe and Rousseau and so on, Rousseau with his Nouvelle Heloise, which was again about seduction, this thing was so popular that libraries could lend it out by the hour. And again, it swept Europe. People were learning to take off on a kind of magic carpet into purely mental realms. They suddenly learned that they had a world inside them and that they could spend hours, days in there, completely forgetting the external world. And then when Sir Walter Scott invented what was virtually the kind of historical Technicolor movie, the thing became even bigger. And the interesting thing is that it was not until this point that pornography was invented. There had been no pornography before a man called John Cleland wrote a book called Fanny Hill, soon after Richardson's Pamela came out. And they promptly arrested him, dragged him in front of a council and said, "Why did you write this dirty book?" And he said, "Well, I needed the money." And they said, "Okay, we'll give you a pension for the rest of your life, provided you don't write any more dirty books." And he didn't, and he lived to be 86, living on his government pension. And the interesting thing is that nobody else wrote dirty books either. Until round about the year 1830, you suddenly get the pornography explosion. What one French writer called books that one reads with one hand. And this was something completely and entirely new. It was inevitable that it should happen, that we should harness these sexual energies in exactly the same way that tantric Buddhists harness the sexual energies for meditation purposes. We were using sexual energies for the purpose of fueling this sort of magic carpet. It's also fascinating, by the way, that sexual perversion, in our modern sense of the word, did not appear until the 19th century. You'll find little bits of it in earlier centuries, but for example, there's a book by Guido Ruggiero on sex crime in 15th century Venice, and there is nothing that we would call a sexual perversion in it. It just did not exist because people had not yet learned to use the imagination. Thank you very much. Now, I'm actually coming to my central point, which is this. Man has learned to use the imagination quite steadily over the past 2 centuries from the birth of the novel. Until now, he lives almost 50% of his time in a world of imagination. Ah, thank you. And yet, in spite of this, he still has not learned how to escape this terrible feeling of boredom, the feeling that the triviality of everyday life drags him down. This is what my first book, The Outsider, was all about. All these people who experience these lovely feelings of ecstasy, you know, sitting on hilltops, reading, meditating in sex and so on, and then found that they came back to earth with a bump and simply could not take off again. So that you've got this terrifically high suicide rate among people in the 19th century, among the great writers, poets, musicians, and so on. Now, this problem of the imagination, you can see, is very closely related to what I was saying to you earlier about Arnold Toynbee and Faculty X. You see, you can see clearly, imagination in its ordinary sense is not Faculty X. Imagination is merely the power to conjure up daydreams that probably have no connection whatever with the real world outside you. Animals possess this extraordinary capacity to relax and, so to speak, to contact the universe, to relax into the bigger world around them. Human beings have deliberately got rid of that capacity because we did not need it. I've cited in The Occult the tiger hunter Jim Corbett, who said that he had an extraordinary sense of when a tiger was lying in wait for him in the jungle. He called it jungle sensitiveness, and it saved his life again and again. Well, that's all very well for a tiger hunter, but for the rest of us, this faculty would be completely useless. The Scottish poet Hugh MacDiarmid once told me that his dog always knew when he was coming back from a long journey several days before he came back. So his wife always knew when he was on the way back because the dog went and sat at the end of their lane. He told me that on one occasion the dog went and sat there before he himself knew that he was coming back. But you can see, this faculty did the dog no good whatever. I mean, it just sat there. And this is the real problem with so-called paranormal faculties. They're basically rather useless to us. And what's more, when people have these paranormal states, they tend to open up, so to speak, open up the mind so they become aware of sudden intuitions. But on the other hand, they find it very difficult to concentrate. During the war, a Dutch house painter called Peter van der Hurk fell off a ladder and smashed his skull. And when he woke up in hospital, found that he could read other people's minds. So that when someone shook his hand, for example, he knew that this man was going to be murdered a couple of days later by the Nazis. When he said this to someone, he was almost killed himself because the Dutch resistance assumed that he was a German spy who had inside knowledge. He was only able to convince them finally that it was second sight. When he left hospital, he found the trouble was that although he now had this instant knowledge of what was happening in other people's minds, he could not concentrate on anything to do a job. His mind was like a radio set, picking up 20 stations all at the same time, and just creating hopeless confusion. And it wasn't until someone suggested that he should do this on the stage for a living, and he changed his name to Peter Hurkos, that he actually managed to escape the problem that smashing his skull had dumped upon him. We do not need these powers, and what's more, they would impair our efficiency as living units hopelessly. So in a certain sense, there's no point in talking about going back to that old unified sense of the universe that our caveman ancestors had. But you can see there's another possibility. What Arnold Toynbee did, no animal could do. Toynbee required to know all about exactly what happened at the Battle of Pharsalus. When that happened, he literally saw the battle reenacted, partly because he was in a state of deep relaxation and he had relaxed below the normal threshold. What he'd done was to develop the power that Jung calls creative imagination, or active imagination, and that Jung himself developed accidentally when he was in such a state of nervous tension that he suddenly let go, afraid that he would go permanently insane, and instead found himself falling down a kind of mental rabbit hole and apparently ending on a pile of soft rubbish at the bottom. And then he got up, looked around him, and apparently found himself in a kind of low cave with a dwarf standing in one corner and so on and so forth. He describes it all in his autobiography. But the main point is that after that, Jung could do this at any time. He'd gained the power of creating this peculiar mental sense of other times and other places. We all possess this peculiar faculty. It's quite obvious that man in the 20th century has evolved through the past 2 centuries to a new stage. and that this new stage involves a far more active way of using the mind than animals could ever manage. And yet, if we can somehow combine what we know intellectually, as Toynbee had to, knowing history, with this strange clairvoyant faculty, the two can somehow combine to produce these flashes of faculty X. What I'm saying is that somehow we know instinctively how to do it. It's only because we don't know that we know instinctively how to do it that we don't do it. As I say, when I knew I could use this faculty writing the film script, I used it, and it worked. And I've done this kind of thing on a number of occasions. It also, by the way, causes curious synchronicities. Once I get very interested in something and I'm in good form, quite suddenly, the name or whatever it is comes up again and again. It happens to everybody, but in my case, sometimes to a preposterous extent. Obviously, in some strange way, my mind knows how to do this. Either that or, you know, there are spirit forces out there doing it to convince me. But I always get the feeling when these weird synchronicities happen that something behind me is poking me in the ribs and saying, you're going in the right direction, keep on. And that, of course, is the point. This feeling, you're going in the right direction, keep on. Because most of us spend our time wandering around in circles, not knowing what direction to go in. Kierkegaard said, you know, you stick your finger into the earth to find out what country you're in. I stick my finger into existence, it smells of nothing. What am I doing here? How did I get here? What am I supposed to do now I'm here? Is there a director around? If there is, take me to see him. I want to see the director. All of this, the basic existentialist feeling that we don't know why we're here, we don't know what we're supposed to do now we're here, disappears as soon as you begin to use these curious faculties. And as I say, something prods you in the ribs and says, okay, you're going the right way, keep on. This is what fascinates me so much. I'm now 56 years old, and I've been writing books now for over 30 years. Fortunately, after my first book came out, The Outsider, in 1956, the critics decided that I was a total fraud, and thereafter began to hatchet all my books. Mind, it happened to some extent to all the so-called angry young men of the period, as it did to members of the Beat generation here in America. But at least it meant, you know, that I moved off to the country and proceeded to work quietly on what really deeply interested me, instead of wasting my time in a sort of literary set in London, as, say, Dr. Johnson did. The result is that I begin to feel, now 30 years later, for the first time, that I am really beginning to understand. That even over the past 5 years, I'm really beginning to take leaps of understanding that enable me to pull things together for the first time. That's why, when I come to somewhere like America, I suddenly have this tremendous urge to try and communicate what I can actually see. I've been talking absolutely non-stop ever since I landed 2 weeks ago. Look at my next book when it appears, a sequel to The Occult called The Occult Vision, in which I've tried to put absolutely everything that I've ever learned about this subject in the past 20 years.
When does it come out?
I'm going to Esalen tomorrow and then back to England on Thursday. And hopefully I'm returning to San Francisco this time next year.
Do you think you're tapped into that cosmic consciousness that Jung has talked about so much?
Do I think I'm tapped into the cosmic consciousness? No. In an odd sense, I'm not at all. I'm extremely reasonable and rational, never experienced much outside myself. But when I put myself into moods of sufficient energy, suddenly things start to happen right. And what's more, I know, as soon as they begin to happen, that I'm going the right way. And if I increase the amount of energy, they happen even righter. And it's a peculiar sense of being able to take over your own destiny instead of being pushed by the outside world. Any more questions before I stop?
Do you think that faculty has a physical basis, or is it purely controllable by the intellect?
Do I think the faculty has a physical basis? Yes, it has. It's definitely, to a certain extent, a build-up of a kind of physical energy. And this physical energy, oddly enough, is collected by the left brain, the ordinary, rational left brain. The left brain is the gatherer of power. It's the thing that whenever you get fascinated by something and you proceed to concentrate on it, it's the left brain that gets fascinated, and the left brain that concentrates, and the left brain that builds up a peculiar internal energy, which is definitely physical in basis. Just one more.
Well, imagination, then, you think, is the feeding from the right brain to the left?
Imagination is undoubtedly the feeding from the right brain to the left. Or rather, it's a kind of relaxation into the right brain. You can actually, as I did, as I said with the film script, you can actually relax into the right brain as if into on a sort of waterbed, at which time suddenly the images and so on begin to flow of their own accord. Just one more. Yeah.
Why do you sort of throw imagination off to the side as a sort of, it seems to be a sort of inferior function that has no basis to reality? Why do you just sort of cast it aside?
No, what I'm saying is that the kind of imagination that developed as a result of Samuel Richardson, and more particularly with the romantics of the 19th century, this was pure fantasy, escapist fantasy.
But there was a reason for that escapist fantasy.
Oh, sure, there was a reason for it, but it was still escapist fantasy.
Necessary to making a psychic wholeness of.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I would agree with that too, yep. But I would still say that nevertheless, the reason that they found life so difficult, right up to Thomas Mann, who still believed that if you were an artist, you doomed yourself to death, that, you know, you'd be better off as a businessman if you really wanted to stay alive. Right up to this time, the artists felt themselves to be totally out of touch with reality. Now, when I wrote The Outsider, I sometimes suspected that this was true, that maybe wanting to be a writer had doomed me, like John Keats and every other, you know, writer who really had seen this vision, to early death. My feeling being, okay, well, if that's so, I'd rather die early than be completely bored for the rest of my life. But in point of fact, what I began to see in The Outsider was that the choice is not nearly as difficult as that. That most of those 19th century outsiders died out of self-pity and stupidity, not out of any basic metaphysical bias of life to destroy the intelligent. And once I'd become absolutely convinced of this, I began to, as it were, try to develop it in subsequent books, and develop it moreover, you know, in my own life. And I found that living alone in the depths of Cornwall was very conducive to doing this. So that, you know, over the years, I suppose I haven't ceased to be an outsider, but I've totally ceased to be a romantic. What I'm preoccupied with is not imagination anymore, but faculty X.
Have you finished writing your full vision?
Yeah, I finished it the day before I left for America, so if the plane crashes on the way back, it'll be... Sorry? Where does dope fit into it all? I can only say that when in 1963 Aldous Huxley advised me to take mescaline, and I did this, it certainly gave me this marvelous sense of universal happiness and relaxation. I felt as if I was on a sort of gentle sea, rocking up and down, and I hated it. I hated every minute of it. I felt as if there was a large Alsatian dog licking my face. I felt as if I was being raped by the universe. And I also, as I say, felt just like Peter Hurkost, that I'd become a radio set, picking up 20 stations at the same time, creating a kind of total mental confusion. So I was absolutely delighted when a few days later it passed away. You know, I could once again think narrowly and precisely. You see, what I'm saying is this. These states of happiness created by things like mescaline open you up so that suddenly the universe can walk in. So you certainly have this sense of universal meaning, as if things are actually speaking to you. But, unfortunately, when you're in this wide open state, you yourself have no power to direct your attention in a beam. Now, in order to write at all, I have to narrow my beam down to something like a searchlight. But there are some times when I get so excited that the beam narrows even more and turns into something more like a laser. And these, for me, are the really creative moments when I get terrific feedback. And they're the absolute opposite of the wide open states. And so I realized, I kept saying to myself under mescaline, oh God, I swear I'll never take this filthy stuff again, while in this mood of ecstatic happiness. Happiness is totally inessential to human beings. Wittgenstein once said, whatever else we're here for on earth, it is not to be happy.
Correctly wonderful. You want me to put these on the table?
Yeah.
Colin, I talked to Chris Bird this morning.